What we do each time is we pick usually a topic. Last when we did the end of last season, we actually had Barry Lyga in, who, if you've never read a book by Barry Lyga, if you happen to like your young adult a bit dark and gruesome, Barry Lyga's your man. He's got you covered with his I Hunt Killers books, which is about the son of a serial killer who hunts serial killers. That's the name. So, but usually we do a topic, and we have a kind of a rotating group of authors who come and talk. And this evening, I am fortunate enough to have Diana Peterfreund here for a second time, and she is the author. Well, why don't you do you want to do anything?
Yes. So I've written 4 adult novels, adult mainstream novels, 4 YA novels, and a media tie-in novel, and a new adult romance novel. And next spring, I'm publishing my first middle grade novel.
So there you go. And also with us for the first time, we have Leah Nolan. And Leah is out in Annapolis, right?
Just south of Annapolis, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And we've done a bunch of festivals together, but this is our first time doing this one together.
Yep.
So what, can you just give a quick...
Yeah, I write young adult. I have 2 books in a 3-book series that is out. The 3rd one should be coming soon if it doesn't kill me. It's killing me, but I have to shut up and write.
Right,
so,
there you go.
Which I have been torturously doing. So, and then I have a contemporary romance for adults that came out in May, and so that's the start of a new genre for me. Very exciting. So
cool.
We can talk about that.
So tonight's topic is writing across genres. Both of our authors here have written, young adult and new adult and middle grade and all these things. So normally now when another person that I always like to try to mention every time, I may have forgotten once or twice, but is Jessica Spotswood. She's also a young adult author. She is actually the person who came up with the idea for this whole discussion series. She approached me and said, John, I'd love to do this series. It's something that Jessica and I have both done up in New York, and I think you guys have done this as well. With David Levithan has this reading series that he does, and he brings a whole bunch of authors in. And Jessica and I talked about what we'd like to see at ours, and one of the main things we talked about was that we wanted a discussion series that was more about craft, more about the actual writing and less about the publishing business, which a lot of these author discussions tend to get bogged down in a lot of business talk. So for the most part, we do focus on craft, but tonight I think, because we're going to be talking about genres and writing across genres, certainly there's craft involved, but you can't really discuss genre without also bringing in some concepts of business. And so one of the first things I'd like to talk to you guys about is, if we're going to talk about all these different genres, how do you define them? What is YA? What is adult? What's the difference between them? What happens when you throw a middle grade into the mix? That kind of stuff. Let's start off kind of looking at it kind of big picture, and then start talking about what your experience of each one has been.
Well, I think it is. You're right. It's a very artificially maintained division. It's an artificially maintained division about what makes something a mainstream novel versus a romance novel or a science fiction novel. I mean, sometimes if you've got a book that sort of has all these different elements, it sometimes comes down to where they think it's going to sell best, that they decide to publish it as and call it. My first 4 books were published as they were set in college, and they were published as adult mainstream books in the United States, or as they were called at the time, chick lit. Because they put candy-colored covers on them and things. But in other markets, in foreign markets, for instance, in Brazil, they were published from the start as teen novels. So even though the characters were in their 20s, they were published for a teen audience and to be read primarily by teenagers.
Do you recall specifically what countries? I'm curious.
Brazil is one.
Is the big one.
China is another one. Russia. They were published by teen imprints rather than adult imprints. And there are a bunch of other books. Sort of, crossover depending on where they're published. The Curious Incident of the Dog in Nighttime was an adult book here. I think it was a teen book or a children's book in the UK. There was that book, the one about death and the little girl and the Nazis. The Book Thief, it was published as an adult book and a YA book in different territories. So it's very much like what people think sort of the market will bear. So, yeah.
And if those chick lit books were published today, they would not be teen or adult. They would fall into new adult.
They would probably fall into new adult.
Now,
but most adult books are being published.
Can you guys help me understand what new adult is? Because I've heard so many different...
Well, I think this goes to, now because we have YA and because we have adult and new adult, it's a little easier to define a book based on the character's age or what the character is doing.
The protagonist's age.
Right, the main character. So if you have someone who is still in high school, generally, and if the voice is right, it generally would be a new adult. Although, Lovely Bones, YA, right. Although the Lovely Bones had a teenager, that's not considered a YA book.
Life of Pi.
Right. So, there are those squishy outliers. But, so if you had a protagonist who's in high school, generally, if it's sort of a commercial voice, I would think that it would be a young adult. And if you had someone in college or out of high school and embarking on that journey of who they are today, how are they going to pay the bills and move out of mom's house or still live in mom's house and deal with rules when you're trying to be an adult, that would be a new adult. And then,
but not always.
Not always.
I mean,
sometimes they would be an adult.
The new adult, is so new. It's like a year old, and it's this trend that's sort of arisen of these sort of women's fictions or romance novels that have these college age or young, sort of like 20 years old, old enough to be in the army and vote, but like not old enough to buy a house in most cases, sort of books. But you don't ever see they already had books about 20-year-old starship captains, and they were just calling them science fiction, like they didn't need to call them anything else.
Right, and typically, to make it even more confusing, new adult has been typically for contemporary romance. But there are some folks that are branching out and coming up with paranormal and
romance.
Right, paranormal romance.
Or futuristic
romance, right? Or maybe sci-fi, maybe romance. So but we'll see if they're going to be successful.
That's the takeaway.
It's a core, in the same sense that
exactly.
young adult tends to have a streak of what? What would we say? Like if there are these kind of...
New adult?
Young adult.
Young adult.
Young adult. Well, if new adult, we can say confidently, generally has a strong romance streak in it. What would we say young adult generally has a strong coming of age?
And there's often, unless it's an issue book, like Scars or something like that, there's generally some kind of romantic element in there. Generally. It may not be the main focus of the
current trend.
Yeah. Okay, currently. I would say. There's usually a girl, there's usually a guy in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Even though
she
may be dealing, or a gal, but whoever your protagonist is, she's dealing with something, or he is dealing with something. Or he may be dealing with something. And there's a romantic interest in there somehow. It may not be the main focus of that character's journey, but typically that's what we see, unless it's more of a literary novel.
Now, one thing I want to kind of explore further because this reminded me of something. So, a project that I'm working on right now that is not done, so it's not going to be published anytime soon. But I began it and I submitted it to my young adult editor, and she's like, "I love this. This is awesome. I have no idea what to do with this." And I was like, I had sent it to another friend of mine, and she's like, "I think it's actually adult and not YA." And so I mentioned that to my editor, and she's like, "Yep, that's it. It's not actually YA," which is interesting because the protagonist is a teenager. But the more you look at it, the more you go, "Yeah, this is not YA." But how can I be so? How is everyone so like? That's not YA. And
is it the voice?
It's when you started talking about the voice and tone. Like, this is a slippery slope as a writer, is understanding voice and tone. And oftentimes it's not something you go into a project fully cognizant of, I wouldn't say. I mean, you guys can just...
Yeah, I had a friend who had a really difficult time selling a young adult project, and it was a really interesting book, and there were two main characters, both female, and one was a sex worker, and she was 15, but she was presenting herself as a woman in her 20s, just sort of for her own protection, and so she wasn't as possibly abused as she might otherwise been. The other girl, also 15, was presenting herself as like a homeless street urchin. Was pretending to be much younger than she was pretending to be like 10 or 11, because people take much more pity on a little girl than like on a teenager who is, you know, begging for food or whatever. So there were these two girls who were actually the same age, who were the protagonists of this piece, who were pretending to be neither of them teens. And it was difficult for her to find a home because she kept getting the feedback, again, this is marketing and not craft, over and over again, that it wasn't explicitly a teenage novel.
Right.
Because both characters were pretending to be not teens.
Which is kind of one, I think, a valid teen experience.
Yeah, and so she had a really difficult time finding, she did find a publisher overseas. She's from overseas. And she had a really hard time, despite being published very well in America in the past, finding an American publisher. And she finally went with a smaller press a couple of years after it came out, after it sold in the other country.
Wow. So when you were mentioning about like tone and if you're, are you guys conscious of a tone when you're writing it? You know, when I began working on that project, it took me by surprise when somebody said it was like, maybe it's adult. You know, I was like, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. That's how unaware I was until it was pointed out to me. Now, what is your guys' experience in terms of tone? Are you aware? Like, for example, Diana, you're working on, what's the middle grade that's coming out?
Omega City.
Omega City, and when's that coming out?
April.
I like how I did that. And so when you began writing on Omega City, you seemed, when you began talking to me about it, you seemed pretty confident right from the beginning, this is middle grade, this is... Am I misremembering?
Oh, you are misremembering, or maybe you're talking to me later, because I wasn't sure if it was young adult or middle grade, and at the time I was looking for a new agent, and I sent the work to my now agent, and he came back and he said, no, this is middle grade, because of the adventure aspect, because of the family aspect. Middle grade tends to be a lot more invested in familial relationships. If you think about, you know, like the people's, like a 10 to 12-year-old's relationship with his parents is a lot more dependent than, say, a 16-year-old who can drive her own car or has a job or any of these things. So, you know, that's why there's kind of a hole in the YA market right now, or in the children's fiction market in general, for 13 and 14-year-old characters, because most people are assuming that the 13 and 14-year-old readers are reading about, you know, the 16-year-old Katniss Everdeens of the world, and they're not necessarily reading about these sort of 8th graders. There are very, very few books out there where you could look at the character and say, this character is in 8th grade. It's just this hole in the market right now. And then middle grade is younger, and I had to sort of rearrange some things in my head to make these characters 11 and 12 years old instead of, say, 13 or 14 years old.
Which things did you have to rearrange?
Just sort of, you know, what they did after school, for instance. Like,
just
were
like
they,
logistics.
Yeah, like if they were 14 years old, it's not as weird for them to just come home from school and like fend for themselves than if they were 11 and 12 years old. I mean, that's more of like a latchkey kid situation. They probably have a neighbor who's checking on them. They have to make sure, you know, they don't have their own money. They, you know, they are in a different situation than they are in high school. They probably don't have as many after-school activities, for instance. High schoolers tend to be on sports teams or whatever, and middle schoolers, like, maybe they are, but they might not be. And so that was interesting. And then when I started writing young adult at first, when I first sold the Secret Society Girl series, the characters are 21 in that, and we had some bids from young adult houses, and they wanted me to age them down to 18. They wanted them to be freshmen in college, which would have really changed the story for the purposes that if you're 21 instead of 18, you're going to bars and you're not using the fake ID to get in. So that was very different. And so when I decided to attack the young adult market, I looked around at all the young adult books and I said, my character is going to be 16 years old. And I'm going to make her 16 because that is squarely YA and I don't have to worry about it.
Now, with your middle grade, is that third person?
It's first person.
It's first person.
And that's good. Thanks for bringing that up, actually, because that's a huge component of genre. The younger you go, it seems, to a point, like YA is, would you say predominantly first person?
Yeah, I had to fight when I wanted to write a third person.
Yeah, and whereas the older you get, the more common third person is. Middle grade really seems to split half and half.
It also, there's a lot of omniscient, which is almost not acceptable in YA at all. The only YA book I can think of
it just makes me want to throw the book across the
Really? Really? But you love those fake narrators. We've talked to you about How to Train Your Dragon. Like you love those sort of like.
That's true. I do love that.
You love the Lemony Snicket.
But it's not a mission. It's Hiccup talking about himself in the third person, looking back on his life. They always bookend every book that way.
But I think that middle grade, you read so many middle grades where they have this removed like storyteller tone. Like it's very once upon a time, these things happen. I mean, you guys, like everyone here has read Harry Potter, right? You know how there were so many books of Harry Potter that opened with this almost like crane shot view of like coming down into the minister's office or coming down into like Voldemort's hideout or, you know, whatever it was. You don't see first person as much in middle grade. Like Percy is first person.
Yeah.
But
Percy
you do
Jackson's
see
a bit old.
Yeah, he does.
Grade.
Yeah. Well, so does my book. It's upper
middle
grade. But you get this storytelling kind of thing, and I can only think of one YA that does that, which is E. Lockhart's Frankie Landau Banks. Is the only way I can think of that has this like sort of storyteller voice that
in YA,
has a narrative.
Not very common.
I mean, YA is so focused on these intimate experiences.
Yes.
So there is a YA voice, yeah.
Yeah. So if we can also, if we're trying to kind of figure out kind of what defines each of these genre age groups, I guess, because it's really what we're talking about is age groups as genres, which is tricky. You know, we're not talking about romance and science fiction and fantasy and horror and mystery, which are all genres. But these age group genres can go across all of those. You could have a middle grade sci-fi, you could have a YA sci-fi, you can have an adult sci-fi. You know, same thing with horror. You could probably say there's some middle grade horror out there.
Oh, there's some great middle grade horror.
Goosebumps is middle grade horror.
Yeah, Goosebumps is middle grade horror.
The Black Book of
Barker
Secrets is middle grade horror.
There's
one that
Lori, what's her face, writes beautiful middle grade horror.
There is a freaky scary called The Toymaker.
Oh yeah. Oh my god.
It's like I read a lot of it because I have a middle grade project that I've been working on off and on. And so I said, all right, I'm going to have to, and I knew it was going to skew sort of horror, so I wanted to read it. And I thought, this was written for 10 to 12-year-olds. This thing is freaky.
There's more middle grade horror, I think, than YA.
It's like Coraline. Coraline, I would say, is middle grade, right? And the other mother with the button eyes. Oh man.
It's like the things that nightmares are.
Yeah, it's like haunting, truly haunting things. But so when we talk about what defines each of these genres and how we cross.
Dull Bones. Have you read Dull Bones?
I haven't read it yet. It's good.
It's good. Well, it's Holly, so it's great.
So it's good. But so if we talk about what defines these genres, and can you describe, now that you've done several genres, can you describe how the experience of writing each one differs for you? I'm sorry,
vastly.
Vastly. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether it was.
Well, because in my young adult, whether I write, I'm writing a contemporary young adult right now, and my series is a fantasy young adult. So those are very
the Conjure series.
Yeah, the Hoodoo Apprentice, which has Conjure and Allure. And the last one will be Illusion.
And then she also writes books that they put covers like this on. So you
can imagine that there are
different things going on.
Right, very, very different. So the experience, these books are first person present. I write in the present when I write YA. So it's very close and very intimate and very like in her head all the time. And and also fantasy, there's always the paranormal stuff that you always have to think about. Okay, so what's the impact of this magic? What's the creepy feeling that she's feeling? So that is something that I'm always cognizant of when I'm writing, because it's more than just the visceral reaction to whatever is happening. There's also the paranormal and freaky stuff that's supposed to be happening. In the contemporary that I'm writing, YA, that it has no magic stuff, thank God, because that just takes another layer that you don't have to think about. And that is first person present as well. But it is much more issue-y, so there's a lot of emotional laden stuff that's going on. Then my editor said, you know, I really want you to write this contemporary romance for adults. And I was like, no. I write sweet romance, no. And she was like, you totally can do it. And I said, no.
I wouldn't be comfortable with that.
I don't think I can't say those words. How can I write them? Right? So she said, no, I want you to try it. So
you had
adult
a glass of
wine. Well, I don't even drink, so I couldn't even rely on that, which I know a lot of writers who actually do. A good friend of mine who writes YA and adult said whenever it comes down to a sex scene, she has to have a glass of wine. I know a number of people who do that. So at any rate, so when you write adult romance,
your editor.
When it's specifically adult romance, usually you have to write 60% of the book from the female's perspective and 40% from the male's perspective. That's just a rough estimate of how you have to do it. So it's all third person, and you're writing from their point of view, roughly. So, you know, then I had to get in a guy's head, and I had to get in a guy's body, which was challenging. Which was challenging. And the voice is totally different because it's third person. And so, yes, you still can get really close and in that person's point of view, but you're writing in third person, so there is more distance. And you do have some of the quips, you know, like there is one thing worth saying, you're an asshole. You know, like you can have that going on in her head. That's actually a line in there. And so that kind of thing would be in young adult as well, but the third person gives you a lot more distance. There's a lot more space than you would have in the YA first person.
I think it's interesting you say that because so two of my YAs are written in third person, in multiple third person, and it helps me give like a bigger picture of the world.
Yes.
You know, it's this like vast spreading science fictional world of the future. And then my romance novel is in first person, her perspective.
Only.
Wow. So you only see her point of view. And I think that you can tell like a really great romance. Jane Eyre is in first person.
Yes.
You know, so you can tell like a very, you know, her intimate sort of journey and her reaction to everything. It used to be when romance as a genre sort of came into the forefront as like a separate sort of market group, like Harlequin started publishing all these books. In the 50s, you only ever saw the girl's perspective. And at the very last chapter in every single book, if you've read any of these like old romance novels from the 60s, which I have because I have a grandmother, at the very end of the very last chapter of every single one of these books, he'd be treating her horribly, like the whole book. And at the very last chapter, these are all very much based on Jane Eyre, the millionaire would come, the Greek millionaire would come to the English governess and tell her that the reason he'd been treating her so horribly was because he couldn't believe how in love with her he was. And he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. And like, would she please say yes? And she does. And
because he's a billionaire.
Presumably live happily ever after on his private Greek island. But, you know, so there is that sort of tradition in romance of being very, and I think it was a major thing in romance when you started to get the perspective of the hero, when that sort of started to come in the 80s, and you started to see throughout the story how much he wanted her. For me, I was writing the romance novel at the same time I was writing in the middle grade, and the middle grade needed lots of research and lots of adventure, a lot of really quick action. So I would write it in the morning when I had lots of energy. And then after my kid went to sleep at night, I would sit down again, and I would have a glass of wine, and all of the sort of like, you know, when you're writing middle grade, there's no romance in it, the characters are kids. I would just sort of like unleash all of my like romantic angst and, you know, write all of the angst and the sexy stuff and the emotional journey of the romance at night. And that's how I wrote those 2 books at once. But I really had to bisect them by many hours so that their voices didn't bleed.
That's impressive because they're so different. I don't know if they could occupy 2 places in my brain at once.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about this, and I feel like we're like circling around this whole like trying to define these, like, because you know we can say generally speaking, young adult is first person, but not always, you know, and generally like adult is third person, but not always, and so there are no. I think what I'm getting from what you guys are both saying is that there are truly no hard and fast rules to this.
No rules, just right.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, if an editor loves it, they're going to buy it. And they're going to find a way to make it work. Sometimes a romance that is predominantly from the woman's perspective might be like a woman's fiction or a women's romance. They might find a way to package it that way. Mm-hmm. But if they love it, they're going to find a way to make it happen. So just write,
Yeah.
you know, and make it great.
Romance, particularly as a genre, is very cutting edge because, you know, they were like the first to really glom onto technology in terms of ebooks, and every time that happens, it's like the Wild West there. I mean, there was a romance novelist that I discovered this year who she writes all of her books. Every other chapter is the boy and then the girl and the boy and the girl, and the girl's all from first person. And the boy is all from third person.
It's that
and her prose is crazy. It's like a runaway train. And her books are all like this long because the characters never use 2 words when 200 will do. And people love her. And I was like, I have to figure out what's going on with these books because all of that stuff sounds totally crazy pants and completely out of control to me. And I picked it up. I couldn't stop reading because there's something about it. It's hypnotic. Like, and she just, whatever it is, she manages to do it, and she doesn't care that people say, like, oh, you should have 60% of this and 40%. She doesn't care about any of that. She just writes these 2 stories about 2 people, however they happen to come to her, and they get published, and people like them.
So is she indie, or is she traditionally
She started out indie, and now she's with Hachette. Kristen Ashley.
Yeah.
They're crazy.
So I just want to get a kind of pulse around the room. Does anyone have any questions about any of this? Is there something specific anyone wants to talk about or explore further in genre?
Can we talk about the logistics of writing?
Logistics.
Genres?
What do you mean by logistics?
Like timing and release schedules and how difficult it might be to promote and whether or not you have to take a pen name.
Oh, you're gonna make us itch.
I'm sorry, I guess that's too publishing and not enough craft.
Yeah. Oh, we
I mean, I guess as much we could talk about it is that I write the middle grade in the morning and the romance at night.
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, one thing I mean, there are a lot of logistics we can talk about. For example, what is appropriate to write in a middle grade versus a young adult versus an adult. Like, can you curse in a middle grade? The answer, no. You know, can you have kissing in a middle grade? I don't know. Can you have kissing in a middle grade?
If it's an older middle grade, you might get a kiss. A kiss.
Like a chaste kiss on the cheek.
Yeah,
perhaps.
but there's no kissy. There's no
yeah.
smoochy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
even Harry Potter got Harry Potter got who? Harry Potter. Oh, okay. He got Cho gave him just a little kiss on the cheek.
Yeah, and then it went YA in like what, book
and
5 or
like,
something.
Whoa!
And
yeah.
they
but that
were
was
like
it.
making out in like book 6 and 7.
Yeah, there's a series that actually spans genres. Are there any
Yes.
other ones like that?
Well, see,
That
it could
grew
do it because
with
it was
the- with the
7
readers?
years.
And
yeah.
it was also Harry Potter.
Yeah.
They could do whatever they wanted to. Yeah.
Although
It's
she
making
planned
the
it to be
rules.
7 before it was.
But did she plan it to grow like that?
But yeah, and we can't say anything
You know
about
what? That
was going on in the
divine
mid-90s,
intervention.
really.
Yeah.
I mean, I really love Ellen Raskin. Am I getting that right? Who wrote The Westing Game, and The Westing Game has that sort of omnipotent thing. But half of the characters in that book well, okay, the only character in that book who's even middle grade aged is Turtle. Most of the characters in the book are adults. There's a couple of teenagers in there, and it's a middle grade book. She wrote another book called something Mystery of Noel, and the main character in that book is a child when the book starts, and then like a 40-something woman for the rest of the book. And there are 2 children characters, but they're not the, like, you know, they're just, it's an ensemble piece. Another middle grade novel that's very famous is from the Mixed Up Files of Miss Basil E. Frankweiler by Cronenberg. And that book is told entirely from the perspective of Miss Basil E. Frankweiler, who's in her like 70s or something. She's writing a letter to her lawyer. That would never get published as a middle grade novel today. Well, I mean, it might, because it's amazing and spectacular.
So are these things that we need to, as writers, keep in mind as we're writing, do you think?
Well, I truly believe that if it's a good book, then it will find its audience, but I wonder what would happen if somebody were to write a Frankweiler-like novel today. If they turned it into an editor, and I know you don't want to talk about the market, but if they turned it into an editor, would the editor say, why don't you rewrite this from the perspective of Claudia? Why don't you rewrite this from Claudia's perspective? Like,
I want to talk about that. Yes, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, I like where you're going with this, I really do. I want to talk, because this is something that I think a lot of writers do struggle with, where you submit maybe a partial or a full manuscript to an editor or an agent or a friend or critique partner, whoever, and they push back with market concerns like that.
Yeah.
And how do you adjust that? How do you, to me, I get very kind of like, don't tell me about my, like...
Well, I love so many middle grade novels, and, Cronenberg was writing in the 60s, so they didn't even have terms like middle grade or whatever.
Right.
And I hope that I don't spoil this for you guys, this 50-year-old book, but part of the fun of the book is as you're reading, you figure out that the lawyer that she's writing to is the children's grandfather. And she's pretending, she's like, these 2 children who she knows are his grandkids.
Does he know?
Oh, no, she calls them by their name, so I think he kind of puts it together, and also I figure that he knows that they've run away from home because their parents are probably freaking out. But she writes this whole letter to tell them sort of their side of the story. Because she does send them home, but at the very end she's like, oh, say hi to your grandkids for me. And it's this beautiful thing, and it's a beautiful mystery that the kids sort of discover together, that the kid readers sort of discover and put together, and it gives them an insight into the way parents think, and I don't know.
So getting back to what you're saying
I would tell her not to rewrite it. If she came back and her critique partner, her agent, her editor said, well, Ms. Cronenberg, you should really rewrite it from the perspective of the kids, I'd be like, no!
Right. Now you would say that with hindsight being 20/20. But what if you were her and you were writing that today, and an editor or an agent or somebody told you, how do you parse that? How do you... This becomes then that kind of balance of marketing, and that's why I get excited, because this is that line between craft and marketing, between, like as Liva says, it's not a goddamn marketing brochure, it's a novel. But that where those two cross, where how much responsibility do you have to serve the market versus serving the art or the craft? How does and this is, I'm saying how do you, but I mean, and I want to discuss this, but I think at the end of the day, we all kind of have to come up with our own.
I think that some of it has to do with how experienced you are as a writer and how much confidence you have in your writing, and whether or not you're willing to make compromises based on just the sheer desire to be published, or whether or not you're like, you know what, I really believe in what this is. Because I can speak from my own personal experience and from other people that I know who made compromises the first time around that I would never, ever make again. And those are valuable experiences because I have learned that lesson. And it stung, and it has really stung. And then you're in a corner, because then you're like, I compromised on something.
Sure, and your name's on the cover.
Yeah. But I mean, the quality it's still something I'm proud of, but there were compromises that I made that I regret. And but that was because, oh my God, someone finally loves this enough to want this kind of thing. So I would never do that again. I mean, I'd be like, thanks, we're moving on. Meanwhile, I was like, okay. So, but I was not a confident writer. I wasn't. I mean, I was a good writer. I didn't know that. I mean, and I say this with humility because writing is painful in a lot of ways because you are putting yourself on that page. In a way, I used to be an actress, and so when I can compare the two. I was up there on stage, but I wasn't me. I was the character. And so I could be as audacious and bawdy that, in a way that Leah, the nice Catholic girl from Long Island, never would be, because I would never do that. But I was dressed as a character and I was in this moment, so I could be that person. As Leah the writer, that is me. I may be talking in the as characters, but that's me. That's my voice in your head talking to you for 300 pages. So it's a very personal and intimate and vulnerable place to be. And the entire process, I would go on casting calls, and they would just look at you and say, next. And sometimes you'd get the job. But you could really say, well, it's just because I wasn't their type. They were looking for a blonde, or they were looking for someone tall. So you can sort of justify it. When an agent or editor says, I'm passing on this, it's because, or they say, the voice is wrong, or, they say cruel things sometimes. Maybe they're trying to be constructive, but it's like someone has they've just sliced you in half, and your guts are on the floor, and you're like, okay. So I'm going to try to put that back in and hold it. Yeah, so, what I'm trying to get to is that it's such a vulnerable place to be that when someone finally, after you have written and rewritten this book 1,000 times, and people have critiqued it, and you finally find someone who likes it, sometimes you're willing to make compromises, or you think you're willing to make compromises that 5 years down the road, you'd be like, you're out of your mind.
Yeah.
So, it's a tough thing.
I think you also have to ask yourself, what kind of career that you want. There is a million writing careers out there, and there's a million ways to publish a book, or to be a writer, or to do what you want to do. One thing when I go to a writing retreat, a game to play is, whose career do you want? And it's not everybody wants to have J.K. Rowling's career. We wouldn't mind J.K. Rowling's castle, but she's in a situation now where she actually has to take secret pen names to be able to write the book she wants to write without the weight of Harry Potter, on every page. There are some people who don't want to write, genre blockbusters that hit all of the sort of commercial fiction notes, and if they're with a publisher that's trying to push them, maybe in that direction, and they'd be happier. I have friends who have left very large publishers for smaller publishers because they were writing books that were maybe a little bit off market, or quirky or something, but they've been really happy there because their publisher maybe found the market for them. When I sold my first book, we had a bunch of different offers, and my agent asked me, and I was 26, and I was brand new, and I was in that glow of, oh my God, finally somebody likes me. And she said, look, it's really easy to say, this publisher is offering you this much money, and this publisher is offering you this much money, and I want to know what you want from your writing career. Do you want to be, what kind of writer do you want to be? And I said, I want to be writing books for 40 years. Like, I want to be making my living as a writer for the next 40 years. And she was like, okay, then I think that this is the publisher that is going to help set you on that path. And we chose that publisher. And I'm here 10 years later, and I'm like, okay, great, 30 years to go. Like, you know, so at the Nova Teen Book Festival last spring, Phyllis Reynolds Naylor was there, and she gave this talk about what it was like to be writing for 40 years. And I was sitting there like crying in the audience because I was like, yes, that would be great. And it's wonderful to see some writers that I know who have been writing for years and years and years and have stayed in the market. And, you know, sometimes they're up and sometimes they're down. At Capclave last year, the guest of honor was George R.R. Martin, and he's having a really good decade. Like, he's doing really well, but it wasn't always that way. And he told this story about this time that his publisher dumped him, and he was like, well, I guess I'll go write for TV because nobody will publish my books anymore. And you know, you make things work, and that's one of the reasons that I do write for different markets, and one of the reasons that I do write for in different genres, and that when self-publishing became a thing, I was like, oh, let me try that, because I think that, you know, that might be a good outlet for me to continue being a writer for 40 years, and I keep that in my head. There are other people, Harper Lee, who says, I'm going to write this book, and then I'm done. I've said what I have to say, and now I'm done. And that's a valid career too. So I think when you make those kind of decisions about what you're going to write and how you're going to change things to the market, you have to do so with a clear vision of saying, do I want someone to say, like me? That's a valid choice. Do I want to be a writer for 40 years? That's a valid choice. Do I have this book that I feel in my gut needs to be in the world, even if I make no money out of it, even if it's only important to like 10 people, but it has to be there? That's a valid choice.
You know what that reminds me a little of, and I'm kind of drawing this to a little bit of the side here, but I was recently listening to an interview with Katee Sackhoff.
Oh.
And, yeah, I know. It's not that I'm obsessed or anything.
Katee Sackhoff, for
yes.
those in the audience who don't know, is an actress.
Yeah, she was on Battlestar Galactica. And but before Battlestar Galactica, she did a bunch of horror movies in which she was basically a scream queen. She's just a very lovely, attractive blonde woman, you know. And so she was basically getting killed a lot in every movie that she did. And she's like, basically, it seemed like everyone was hiring me to die. And she's like, I didn't really like that. I didn't see that for myself as a career. And she says that there's a point in an actor's career where they have to start taking charge of the projects that they do. And they have to be cognizant that these choices you make over time accumulate and become your career. And she's like, that's the point that I said, you know what, I'm going to do this Battlestar Galactica thing. It probably won't do anything, probably won't go anywhere, no one's really care, but at least I can show a different side of myself. And in that, she was cast as this like super tough, like cigar smoking, like badass. And now that's her type. You know, now she's trying to struggle against that type, but I think she seems, in the interview, she seemed more pleased to be that type than the like victimized scream queen.
Have you seen My Evil Ex-Girlfriend?
No.
Oh, you should see it.
Oh yeah? All right.
She's the evil ex-girlfriend.
So, the reason that I bring that up is because this is what Diana is talking about. You know, she's talking about, you know, the choices we make. Every choice that we make, you know, accumulates over time and shapes us into the writer that we want to be, the author that we want to be, the human being that we want to be. You know, I tell my kids this, you know, like, it's, you know, I love to paraphrase Uncle Ben in Amazing Spider-Man when he says that, I think that was the movie, right, where he says the choices you make now will or no, it was Superman. It was Pa Kent in Man of Steel says the choices you make now will determine the man you become and you grow up to be. And I think that the choices you make early on as a writer do impact, you know, and I think it's important that although there are these rules and there's these genres and you need to be kind of cognizant of all of this stuff, at the end of the day, you're the one who decides, you know, you're the one who owns it, you know, and it's important to always kind of keep that at the forefront with, you know, humility and not, you know, be a
or
dick
like,
about
you
it.
know, your rent. I mean, I've definitely taken jobs because I'm like, well, that would be some nice money to have in my bank account.
Right, and that's a choice, though. You make that choice.
Right.
And you're not a victim of that. You can't, you know what I mean? You're like, you know what I need right now is some cash. And I'm going to do this, you know.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like you see a lot of, to go back to actors, we keep talking about actors again, you see all these like British Shakespearean actors who would be like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to Hollywood and play a bad guy, get a big paycheck, come back by my townhouse, and then just do Shakespeare, you know? And so that's, like, it's fine. To, you know, you do what you have to do to make a living. But you also have to, you know, my friend has this talk where she says, you know, you can make the choices you want to do, but then you can't expect somebody else's outcome. You know, so like if you want to write these like maybe very quirky books, that's great, but you understand that you're not going to sell as many copies as Divergent kind of thing. Like you're writing the book that you're writing, and it has this great passionate audience. That's wonderful, but you know there is a trade-off.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else have anyone want to say anything? Yes?
When you're talking about writing for the different ages, in libraries, especially in our library, we separated 6th grade. And so we have things that we buy for 2 sections. We buy actually like twice as many copies of some books because we have them in JF and we have them in YF.
Oh.
So they're discoverable by kids who want to stay on the J side and also want to stay on the Y side.
So what you're saying is if you write books with 6th graders, then you'll sell twice as many copies?
Woohoo! Omega City, out in April. There'll be 7th graders in the next book, but I'm being very quiet about that because I've been told if I say too loudly that there are 7th graders and 13, then like the big bad Barnes and Noble fairy will like descend upon my book and like tear it to smithereens. It's weird hole in the market of like the 13 and 14-year-old characters. I don't know when it's going to be filled.
There's no foreseeable time that pothole will be filled.
It was kind of like the market that existed for new adult. Like there was this market that, like especially in romance, all like the youngest characters were in their late 20s.
Right.
And except for in like historical romance where it was like, you know, Jane Austen, all her characters were 20, and that's fine. But in contemporary romance, you never saw these people who were very young. And so after many years of not seeing them, people just decided to start self-publishing it. And that's how new adult started.
And it turns out there were people who wanted to read that.
There were lots.
Yeah, and then when publishers saw that there was a market, then they decided to buy a lot of these self-published books. And they ended up having to pay a lot of money for it because they were very successful self-published-wise. So they forked over a lot of money.
Publishing is very reactive.
Yeah. Now, this summer I was at an event in Atlanta, and it was called the Day of YA, and there was a panel of industry experts, there were a total of 8 agents and editors, and this very question came up about what about the younger skewing YA, the ones that are for 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds, because not everybody wants to read some of these more racy YAs, because YA is skewing ever older. It's more violent, more sexy, more language. And so, you know, I'm a mom with a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. My 14-year-old is not in any way hindered in anything that she reads, but my 12-year-old, or when she was 12, I didn't think it was appropriate for her to be reading some of this more racy stuff. So, you know, what happens to kids who fall into this sort of, this spot where there's nothing really for them because they're really too old to read the younger middle grade stuff, and they are interested in a teen experience. They just don't want this more grown-up teen experience. And the agents and editors said, we have no place for it, and we're not putting it anywhere, and that's just the way it is. And you know, that was a room of 100 writers who were like, but we write this, and you know, and it was like, sorry.
So the if you build it, they will come does not actually.
I think it would take a book, like a huge mega hit, that was very explicitly about like a 13 or 14-year-old and about that experience. And it would have to be huge. It would have to be like Fault in Our Star is huge, and then all of a sudden everyone wanted to publish it.
Yeah. But the thing is that like in the new adult model, a lot of authors took it upon themselves to say, I'm just going to write this and I'm going to put it out there. They could do that because the adult market is very digital heavy, and so you could put out digital books as a self-published author and create a market. Whereas with kids, they are not digital heavy readers. The statistic that was put out at this same conference was that the adult market is 80 to 90%, believe it or not, digital, and 10 to 20% paper, and that's flip-flopped for the young market. So it really is still generated by agents and editors. It's very, very hard for a self-published young adult or middle grade writer to say, I'm going to put this out there, because you put it out there, but kids aren't reading.
Yeah, a big
tablets,
part of that
typically.
is that even if the kids have these like tablets for school, because I know that that's sort of coming in a big way, they the middle grade and YA market, especially as you go younger, is really driven by schools and libraries. They're the people who buy the bulk of the books and by the Scholastic Book Fair. And that is not a digital marketplace. Like these kids, they buy their books at the library sales. They get books because their librarian told them about it, or their teacher told them about it, or it's on a summer reading list. Or
They do have an online component that they're putting into the Scholastic Book Fairs now.
But it's just, every time I have this conversation with people, and I'm like, the kids are not reading online.
No,
kids are not reading online. I am like, oh, but my kid has a Kindle, or my kid has a cell phone. But I do school visits, and I ask. I always ask when I do a school visit, and like, one or two kids raise their hands. So I think that when I talk to other writers about this, and they're like, oh, kids read digitally. I'm like, your children, the children of you, an author, has a Kindle.
Yes.
Well,
So let's
they
just,
don't have
that's
control
like
of
a
the
very
credit card.
biased.
Right, they can't control mom's credit card or dad's credit card, so they can't buy what they want online. It's just, I sat through a whole presentation where they were just showing that 10 to 20% of sales for the young market is digital. That's just, you can't create a new genre that way. You just can't, or a new niche. You just, on your own.
Well,
So if
On that
anyone out
depressing
there
note.
wants to write the mega blockbuster with a 13-year-old in it,
Yeah.
please do, because this whole has been, you used to see Meg Cabot, a friend of mine calls it Disney YA, because the Disney Channel, if anyone has a kid and therefore watches a lot of Disney Channel,
And Nickelodeon.
has these shows that are ostensibly about teenagers, right? Like Hannah Montana and the Even Stevens and all of these shows. They're like theoretically about teenagers. The audience is like 8 to 10. No actual teenagers watch the show.
Right.
And so
because they're too squeaky
they're
clean.
very
Yeah.
squeaky clean.
Yeah.
And so that
It's
sort
like
of
this Lifetime movie kind of.
yeah, so that sort of Disney YA, this YA which is very young, has sort of been neglected. Meg Cabot used to do it a lot, and then she started skewing older. Have you guys seen Allie Carter's new cover for her new Ambassador series? It looks like Divergent.
Yeah.
And then if you look at her old covers, which had this like cute girl in like a schoolgirl outfit, sort of like smirking at the camera with an umbrella, like that was Disney YA. It was published by Hyperion. Her new book they're very going upper with it. It looks like a thriller novel. And I think that just speaks to the fact that YA is skewing so old right now, and they're really trying to capture the adult market, and they're leaving kids behind.
Yeah, no, there is
This
a
is
pocket.
getting really depressing.
It is depressing.
I guess some of that is inevitable when talking about genres, because it's such a kind of, it can be a frustrating and confining thing. But kind of getting back as we're wrapping up here, I'd like to end on a happy note, and just kind of reinforce this idea that yes, there are genres and there are these limitations, but at the end of the day, YA was generated by people writing books that they were like, there should be books like this, and they don't exist, so I'm going to write them, and it turns out, lo and behold, there was an audience for them. Same thing with new adult. All of these things, it's possible, and a lot of it is readers. If there's a lot of readers for it, then it just lands, and these things can happen, and we are not victims of the machine. Please God. I think we're just about out of time here. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.